Hey everybody, what's up? Today is Sunday, December 10th. We're talking about AMC, an update week over week. At the beginning of this week, we discussed the need going into the week to come up above 730 and really hold this top area. And when that didn't happen, my default is then to look at what I would consider to be the main creek and consider what could or could not happen in this area. Now, I'm going to address the video that Stockfather put out, and I'm just going to address that by saying this, all right? He said it's possible that this is an LSPY after a distributive top. I think that's 100% fair. I think that's a fair assessment. We've had something really similar to this back here in, it was back in 2021 now, going into 2022, And it's a very similar kind of double top setup where we just couldn't advance. We come back down, we trade a little bit lower. This didn't go beneath the range. It's a little different. And then we break down farther. And I've already done a video talking about a possibility of going to $1. And I know that a lot of people were like, that's never going to happen. And I myself don't think it's likely that it's going to happen immediately. I think that a lot of this downward move here was by design centered around, you can see it very clearly, centered around that reverse split. I think that the majority of this kind of rotation happens right around that date in mid-August, which was about a year from the time that APE was created. I don't believe that it's necessarily going to just kind of keep walking down to $1 and then go bankrupt, okay? But that being said, was there a technical case for $1? And the answer was yes. And it goes back to what I was perceiving as this kind of mirrored out trend. Now, looking at the chart from here at this big picture kind of area, you might think that there's no way it's going to just drop because the RSI is so ridiculously low. Well, it is really low, and it is oversold on the weekly, or it was oversold on the weekly. And it has since come back above it. And I think we need to take that into consideration. It looks a little to me like, maybe a flattened version of what we see way back here in 2017. A little bit of what we see here in that April of 2020, bounce. But frankly, the idea that we are just going to rocket and keep going isn't something that I've considered really heavily since the very early stages when we came down here. We first pushed up to 9 and then 10 because, and I've reminded people about this a lot who often will quote this fractal and say, well, it looks a little bit like this. It does. I think it does. And I think that when I was looking at it coming down and doing that bounce, I did think that it was possible that it looks a lot like what we saw here in 2020, albeit much smaller, because we did get at that up thrust and then the secondary one that goes a little bit higher. These check that top range and then they come down. The problem is we didn't stop, right? And I had talked early about, this was back in mid-November, talked about possibly getting that rebound up to 9, and it just didn't happen. Every time there was a setup for it, it just failed. And one of the things that's very difficult when you're trading based on sort of past performance or you're looking at the possible setup is you have to be very willing to adjust. And if you're not willing to adjust, you're just going to get upset and offended and think that nothing works. Because when you look at something like this, I see possibility. I don't see a definite breakout. And what happened is it distributed, right? It failed at the top. And this was back around 832. And so we didn't go back up. We didn't have that high bounce. Instead, we came low. And I'm still optimistic because we've seen setups like this that work in our favor and they end up breaking back to the upside and it can be decently strong. But on the whole, I've gone slowly and slowly shifting towards a more bearish outlook, not because I don't think it could run, but because I think that on the whole, I don't believe we're going to get to 45 anytime soon. I think that there's a strong likelihood, in my opinion, that we might make a move up to near 14. And I've already done a whole video about that, and a lot of it has to do with this chart right here and why I think it's likely. I'm going to look at weekly really quick, and then we'll talk a little bit about this LSPY possibility and that downside possibility. And I'm going to show you what I think's likely to happen. And it's this scenario that I've been kind of pitching on and off for the last several videos, that I think we get an early bounce here and then we kind of come down. I think we get a bounce and then we come back down, as opposed to just kind of sliding off the face of the earth right now. It's not impossible that that happens. Again, RSI is just one indicator. This is what I'm seeing right now, is that by doing this kind of double top cat ear formation, we definitely started a distributive act. It came down low in the range. It came below the range. It's retested at this point 7. You can see on our chart right here, I'm going to zoom in a little bit, that it's largely been kind of a stinky rejection after 7:30. We haven't been able to really make strong advancements, though we do have a somewhat of a bottoming that occurred late in the week. You can see that it rejected on 7, I believe it was even right on Friday morning, and that would be the bottom here. So it kind of presents itself as a possible place where you could just fall. And to that end, I don't disagree with Stockfather's assessment that this could be essentially like a bear flag, right? And it's about to distribute again. That's all there is to it, okay? Whether or not you think from this point it just drops straight to $1, or you're going to look at something a little more judiciously and say, well, I think it can come down maybe to that 490 target that Booksy had, and then maybe we see a larger bounce or whatever. It doesn't really matter. You can look at this an infinite number of ways, all right? The idea is it possible? That's the question. And I think the answer is yeah, it's possible. I don't think it's impossible. Now, some people have been really quick to note that that doesn't make any sense with market cap value. Hey, I don't disagree. All right, I'm not arguing against that. I'm not arguing the fundamental case here. I do think that on the weekly, you can see that it's oddly, even in this downtrend, it's come above. It seems like it's found some support on that moving average, which is unusual. And when you look back here, the only other times we've really done this were more or less like in times of uptrend, where we already had some movement to the upside. You can see here we have a bit of support. Try not to mess it up. I know this is a weekly chart. We have a bit of support way back here in April, and it resulted in a little more upside before we came back down. But then you got to look at where we were. I mean, this was teasing out the 50. We were honestly, you can see that distribution here pretty easily with those double points at the end here on the setup here, as opposed to where we were previously. Just looking, more short term, you can see it on the weekly. There's not that many other times where this has really done this, where you see this kind of a bounce off of what seems to be, a bounce off of the weekly moving average. This is an example of one, and this is kind of where I'm at right now, is I think we're going to make this kind of push up and then come back down. I think it's going to be a bit more like head and shoulder like in the end. If we are going to come back down, I think we're probably going to see the 8s before we see the 5s, for example. And I think that seems likely to me. But, you can go back and you can just look at it. There's just not that much evidence. We've got, again, way back here, 2019, there was some place where it kind of grabbed on top, and you can see that once again, you got the little cat ear kind of set up before what seems to be a distribution down. I don't think that there's a lot of great examples of this, primarily because we don't have that much data. This is not the oldest stock in the world, and frankly, the places where we do have kind of breakouts on the weekly, most of them are fairly benign. Like, the price action doesn't really do too much. This is more moderate rise. The main places where you see major action on that kind of breakout are these up thrusts that occurred in March and August. You can see those break above and they go really far, especially the one in August, once it kind of bounces. And then the rest of them, I think it's debatable, but I think you probably would say this is the only real area. We had that reaccumulation May to June. I would say that's probably the only real area you see it really garner support and then push up again and have a considerable price movement, right? So it's difficult because we're working with pretty limited data. The way that I've drawn this is very important in my mind because I'm thinking about this in terms of sine waves, okay? And this is where I don't think Stockfather and I would necessarily disagree, but I don't think we're on the same page about it. I see this as a gigantic cross of a wave. And then what I'm seeing right here is that we've got kind of a secondary push across bouncing, right? So we've tested it once, we're testing it again. This is like onset the trend that was previous here. And we've been talking a lot about the need to kind of recapture some kind of a creek. And I think that it's demonstrably, right there. I think we're basically right on it right now. And I think it's really low. It's very extreme. And it seems ridiculous because, again, we had that reverse split with that serious drop. And again, it does look like it's mirroring outward, and it looks like it's missing that test back to this guy right here, which, we haven't gone to yet. I don't see it, even if it were mirroring out. It's hard for me to imagine this thing just dropping from here without going back up and redistributing. I do think there's been a lot of buy-in recently. And to be honest with you, the way this is setting up on the macro still to me could present itself much like this. Now, whether or not this ultimately kind of like goes to the moon or it breaks down and falls off the face of the earth in what looks more like a head and shoulder, I think that's yet to be seen. But we haven't made any of these moves yet. We just haven't. All we've done is kind of done a little bit of this. And I think that it's possible, yeah, we could come down lower. This could be like that 490 hit, that $5 target that a lot of folks have talked about before moving back up, okay? I'm not against any of those in terms of like whether we get there first or not. And I actually think that if we were for some reason to find support now and go up to 14, I don't personally think it would hold. I think that we would likely see a major sell-off and we would come back down low again, okay? But the ideas that I'm talking about have a lot to do with the sine wave analysis, which has to do with that master fractal kind of business that I always talk about. And so when I look at this on the big picture, it's easier for me to see this as kind of like, oh, it's the shrinking iteration. It's the side after the side. And I know that I have misinterpreted this in the past to being sooner than later. And to that end, all I can say is, look, I got it wrong. I'm sorry. That's all there is to it. But I will say this, is that when I look at this now, and I'm kind of struggling to get this right, I still see it in much the same way as I see that master fractal. And I don't think that we're in a position, I can't even draw this right. Irony. I don't think we're necessarily in a position where it's time to sort of like throw up our hands and say, yeah, it's going down. You know what I mean? It's done for. When I look at this, I'm still looking at this in terms of that master fractal and what that means for the stock. Even if, in the grand scheme of things, it's not the exact same. It doesn't work out. I believe that it's a really good teaching and learning tool. It's not really ever given me anything that's completely wrong, as opposed to just my being off in terms of timing, right? In and of itself, I still think it's probably the best way to understand the movement of AMC across the market. I really do. I feel like I've seen everything from it, and at the same time, like, there's very little that, doesn't kind of fit within that purview, that window. I'm looking for it right now. I'm not seeing it, and that's frustrating. All right, here we go. Yeah, I guess what I need to do is mark off the one that's newer, because I took a picture of one that I found an old screenshot and it worked really well instead of using the one that I always use, which is kind of getting really messy. So let me make sure I get this. I know you're thinking like, man, this is wildly unprepared, but it is what it is. Maybe it is a little bit unprepared. Well, I guess I could bring it up regardless. I don't know what happened to it. That's frustrating. As I took a new screenshot and it's really clean. I want to use that and not the other one. Well, I'm not going to waste any more of your time. So I'll just go ahead and use this one. So this one's really messy. I've just saved over it too much. I still think this represents what we're experiencing. And I know that when I position it like this, you're probably going to be like, what? dude, that looks almost exactly the same in terms of like that waveform. Well, I think in terms of the waveform, it is basically the same. And I think that I had argued for a long time, perhaps to the annoyance of many, that this area right here was probably that January move up to, all the way through June. That it was actually a big bridge, right? And now we're kind of in a free fall, and we're definitely lower, and I think that's obvious. But if you look at the RSI, it kind of tells a different story. It makes it seem like, really all we've done to most, would be this. I think it's a lot of people would look at this, and I think I could easily say, yeah, I think we've pretty much gone to the edge of this guy right here, and we've dropped off. And I don't necessarily think we're about to rocket like this, like straight up. And I know you guys are like, well, wait a minute, because you just said that if it's like right there, then we should be ready to go. Well, I think we're really close, but there's a lot that happens in this bottom that's not easily visible, and it can get quite complex, and it can continue. It can continue for a lot longer. There could be a longer accumulation here. This is a very minor, tiny schematic. You don't see extended hours action right here. There's a lot of stuff that happened in extended hours that could also be a contributing part to it. But I really do believe this. And I think that at the end of the day, what it boils down to is these are the last cat ears. This is the last cat ear. And I think that for me, on my part, I'm just waiting for that recovery. Now, does that necessitate that it goes up now? No. And I think that's where we're going to have some leeway. Is like this could still be going down. You know what I mean? For all we know, it's not even close to being oversold enough. And we might still need to go really low, before anything else happens. And that could be what we see here in a kind of up thrust and then downward move where you get like a pop and then another drop. It could be this LPSY on the whole that Stockfather's talking about. We're seeing like micro iteration of a bigger picture here, and you're going to get more drops before it's over. Not at all out of the question, okay? I'm just of the opinion that in the grand scheme of things, I don't believe that it's just going to drop and go right down to $1. I just don't. So I understand like his logic behind it. It's nothing against his logic. I understand the Wyckoff logic behind it too, the point and figure logic. I think that the reverse split helped drive this price really low. And I don't think that even if they have a pathway that could get them to $1, I don't think it's necessarily going to go there. So I know that I had that video title, but a lot of people have been like quoting me on it and they haven't even watched the video. So here's what I'm thinking, okay? And we're 18 minutes into this video. I want to try to wrap it up pretty fast. I'm not going to give you every single explanation for why I think this is likely, but I'm just going to do it just like I did last week. So last week I said it needs to come up above 735 and then find support at 726. And if it breaks 726, it's probably going to come down low back into the range. And that's what happened. So it becomes a bit bearish. You could have wrote it down and then sat on it, right? I think that at least for now, I think it's crossed back over. I think it's tempting itself to come back up. We're on the 2 hour right here. You can see that it's turned. It's made some crosses on RSI. Up to the 1 hour, I did get buy signals on my RSI indicator. That doesn't mean it's definitely going to happen, but it looks a lot like the same kind of setup that we see here in this bottom, but it's a little bit flatter. It's very, very similar in terms of the RSI pattern. With the cross, you can see it. It could just mean that we're just going to go up and experience another a UTAD, right? Like another distribution. I think that's possible where we can come up again and redistribute back around 740. And in that case, it's just like a head fake, and you're just going to then drop off the face of the earth, right? So what I'm looking for is I'm going to do the same thing I did last week. I'm going to tell you what I think is possible, and then I'm going to tell you what has to happen for that to be accomplished. Then we'll talk a little bit about what happens if it doesn't, right? So here's what I think. I think it's very likely that we're going to see a push up to about 720 earlier in the week, okay? I don't think it's a shoe-in. I just think it's likely. I think we're going to see a bit of a bounce back to 7. If it can whip around 7, about equal parts around 7, as it did here, then I think what's going to happen if it can find support is that we're probably going to see a decent takeoff. At that point, you then need to find support above the previous highs around 740. So first step, probably around 7, near the 720 something, top of the range. Drop back down, find support at 7. If it can push up high, it has to find support up here. Now, I'm not just doing that because the EMAs are here, though that does make it nice and convenient. Really has to do with some of these key levels, right, that need to be tested. And these are the main ones that I'm looking at. I'm doing like little squiggly football stuff today, but you can see what I mean. You know what I mean? It's super straightforward. I think that's all there is to it. And I do think if you get that, my price target off the bat is my price target off the bat is way up here at like 865, 870. The reason for that is really simple. There's a widening. It's got one, it really starts here. 1, 2, 3, that's 3 loose hits, but 1, 2 strong hits, 3, 4, 5, and then it breaks out and it's retesting it. This to me is a widening downtrend, which typically has a breakout target of the place where it started widening, which is up here. All right, pretty simple. In addition to that, you can see that this is also a widening on the bottom. It's called a, I know Bukowski calls it a widening with a 90 degree, because if you look here, there's like a 90 degree bottom, right? But it's widening and ascending at the same time. All right. And then what this is, if it breaks out, is that this is a broadening channel with a partial decline. And what that means is that there's a partial decline to try to bring the price back down, but sellers don't achieve the bottom. So then it turns back around. It usually is a stronger breakout, but nonetheless, I did the price target for it, and surprise, surprise, you know, once you do the price target where the breakout is, it's roughly the same exact space. So I think there's plenty of evidence right now that based on where the moving averages are, based on the setup here, both the widening down and the widening bottom, that if it manages to hold here and pushes above 7 again, I do think you're going to see that 860 area. From that point forward, I'm a little more inclined to think that we're probably going to redistribute and then head back down. The longer this has gone on, the more I'm thinking that's likely, and I think it's going to be really nasty and abrupt. I do think that these will be probably some kind of a double up thrust kind of business where you trade across this area right up here where there's low liquidity. We still haven't gotten back there from earlier. Even though we jumped over it before, I still believe that this is going to be an area where we find a lot of selling that happens, and then probably from that point, maybe up to even roughly right here at 9, you'll see that. And I do think that's right in this pocket of low liquidity. I think you're going to redistribute down, and then you're going to have that bigger breakdown. That's my thought right now. Okay, so what needs to happen is pretty straightforward. If that doesn't happen early in the week, I'm talking about Monday, Tuesday, we don't see these advances. Okay, Monday, Tuesday, we don't see these advances. I am inclined to go with what Stockfather's saying, that this is just an LSPY and we're going to distribute. I don't believe we can come back below this guy right here again. I think that this in and of itself is probably about as low as we want to go. Holding that 681 was really critical for a lot of reasons. And I don't want to, again, get into the same things I talked about in the previous video too much. I'm going to use this one because it's not as messy. But the big thing here that I'm looking at is, it's again, in order for this to have that breakout, much like that master fractal, you have to see that it holds, you know, this guy right here. And these hits where that blue is, back here, here, and then here, those 4 spots are really important. And they basically are represented here as well on our chart. When you look at, I'll use circles. When you look at that level right around 681, you can see it was established as this important kind of drop zone back here, even in the very beginning. I think this represents kind of your launching pad. It ends up being like almost the highest liquidity we have, if not the highest right there. You can see that, again, it was taken off right here. And then when we get to the bottom, this is where we are again. going into this week. So at the moment, right, I'm not going to say like right now this looks great. It kind of looks like an inversion where you've got a bit of accumulation and then a distribution inversion, which is going to flip down. Don't get me wrong, it doesn't look awesome locally. It also failed to jump that creek again, which is kind of a bummer. And we had talked about that previously. That was like the one that's like here, right? And I remember we talked about it specifically right there. You can see it. All right, that's a big one. But there's other ones here, and I think that's why I'm kind of watching and with very basic simplicity here. I believe that if it kind of drops that 681 level again, and it does not find buyers, that there's a stronger likelihood that it's going to then just sort of come down pretty low. The S-curve on this model, on this breakdown, I should say, isn't awful, but I do think it'd probably be somewhere around, and this is the tough part. I'm trying to look at volume down here. I'm not sure this one or this one is lower, but it's probably going to be somewhere around that 640 area. Okay, that's what I think. And I think that coincides with what I'm seeing here as this creek has been tested, that we would come down low and then bounce along the 640. You can see how that would work out as like a decent S-curve target if it dropped down lower. All right, and then it technically is still on the outside of this, so it could have a reversal, but there's a whole lot of other then questions you'd have to ask about the breakdown here, so on and so forth. So I do believe that in a lot of ways, this is primed to come down lower, but at the same time, we're not quite there yet. And I do think, yeah, it's not that difficult to see a run if it can make that advancement. I did some Elliott wave math, and it's in a really nice place to get a good push up here. But in terms of the setup, I'd say it's a strong mixed bag. Okay, and look again, this right here was the moment of, crap. And then you're looking at this like, well, it needs to then do this and do this and do this to come back. We've had a couple times where it's worked out. In the previous range, it right here was very similar, where I said, hey, it has to do this, this, and then it can go. And it did. It did exactly that. But that doesn't mean it's going to do it now. So you got to kind of just watch it and see how it goes. So I'm really looking at 681. I think if it drops 681 in hooks, I think it's going to drop pretty far. I think it's going to come all the way back down fairly low. I think that's highly likely. I think if it can hold this area going into Monday, Tuesday, and reverse and really show some strength, you might be in pretty good shape for a move to the upside. Now, there's going to be a lot of naysayers who say, like, immediately, I know every time I do these videos, there's always somebody out there who's like, well, I think it's just going down, you know what I mean? Well, look, I don't disagree it's possible. I don't even disagree that the setup might even favor that at times. What I see here is something that I haven't really talked about in a really long time, and it's a bit odd because I don't even really know how to like describe this without talking in like older terms. But I kind of see that well, I used to call it like a volcano top and then the mountain top. And the volcano and the mountain, while they're ascending, remind me a lot of the way I used to do things, where you'd look for that and then you would watch and see if the last one appeared. And the last one was always the cup. And this, I haven't done this in a really long time, but that would be like, even if it dropped here, it would still be like come up and then basically form like a cup top. And then you get this pretty gnarly breakout. And it ends up being essentially like an inverted head and shoulder move. You can see what I mean, where, man, I keep doing that. Sorry, I'm in like Adobe mode. So I keep grabbing the, I keep grabbing the space bar, trying to grab the screen. But yeah, you end up with this kind of like head and shoulder business here, right? Where you're now distributing, and these are your shoulders. You're not distributing, but you're accumulating, right? And these are your shoulders in advance. And you get these kind of bigger push-ups, right, that form out this shoulder motion, and then you end up dropping back down to once again sort of check these lines. And it should take you pretty far, okay? And I do think this is possible, if not even likely, because I don't believe that we've actually come back up and checked where we dropped off from. And you can see why that might be beneficial to come back down to this area and check this level again if it hasn't been checked yet. And I don't think it has. I know that there was a distribution here, but I don't believe it's been checked. I don't necessarily think, though, that it then needs to go further. But if it did, sure. That's where I think you get that bigger move up to 14. Does that make sense? So to me, I'm like, yeah, I could totally see it coming back down here first and then going, as opposed to just dropping. So again, I see it as that kind of volcano mountain, and then it needs to make that little U shape, push up, find support. I think it's likely that it could go. It could be a pretty decent run to the upside. I did trajectory targets right here, 60 degrees, 60 degrees. That's a 67, but it's because I did it in extended hours trading, so it'll fix it. So 55, 55, in and out angles, matching from these two bottoms from the low here. It does go up to hit this particular point. And I know you're thinking like, well, why does that, who cares about that? Well, I do, because that's a 50% marker on this. So it just so happens that when you take this and you drag it across to the bottom, this is a perfect 50% intersection. So from the bottom here through that 50% on that drop, gives you the same angle of descent that you get here, right? Going into first hit to last hit on either side. And I think that's important because a lot of times trajectory in, trajectory out will match. And so you would expect them to be mathematically tight. Doesn't mean it's going to happen, but hey, if it goes up now, that's likely one of the targets it's going to go to. Point in case, if you do this in previous ones, in previous areas, and you go from like top to bottom here, and then you use the 50% marker, you can see that oftentimes it points to whatever high you're about to go to next. Because again, sine waves, right? So it's possible, if not very likely, that if this does find a breakout, whether it be into the 13th or maybe it happens like last minute, that this week could see a pretty big week to the upside. I think conversely, same deal. If you break down, you're looking at a pretty nasty slide to the bottom. So whether this happens and you go up first or we just break down first, I think you're looking at some pretty steep downside in the near future. If it cannot, at some point breach that 823 level, I think it's likely going to come back down pretty hard. And here's the thing, right? Let's say, for example, I'm right and it comes up to, let's just pretend it's like the high hits is on Thursday or something. And it's, I don't know, 821. I think the highest I've got it going was here. This was one of the higher targets. It's like 866. We can look at this and sort of make a judgment on what we think it might be. I have 867 from back on this chart a while back. Let's just say by Friday it were to do that. Well, at that point, you've now got a new spread, right? You've now got a new 50% spread. And that gives you a sense of where that top might be. It's actually not surprising. I mean, just again, I don't know. Things like this just tend to work really well. It looks like it's right at the previous top. So then I would just take a line here and go through the previous top. And that gives you pretty solid way of kind of measuring the S-curve if it were to come back down. So the suggestion would be then that, hey, if 490 is where we're going, which again, I still have a lot of intersections there, that you're basically doing a big cross and then coming back down. And that could be something that you see in early January. So this is pretty wildly different than some of the early estimates that I had, but I still think it's really important to note that even if it comes down here, as crazy as it might seem, this particular move to like 490 doesn't seem that odd to me if it were to happen in that particular order, and I still think you're possibly going to go right back up. And part of the reason is that when you look at this mathematically, again, I know it's like kind of beating the same drum here over and over again, but just take a look. When you go from the top to this particular bottom, what's the 50% retracement? All right, well, it's the top of this widening, which just so happens to be two of the targets that we've already gotten. So a 50% retracement on this first move down would take you back up to 864. That doesn't negate a bear move that could follow. It just is a retracement of 50%, right? Okay, so what, Booksy? That's kind of interesting, but it doesn't mean it's going to happen. No, it doesn't. It's just that that also happens to be like a really clean place to come back and check. That's where we've had breakouts, right? We've had resistance and breakouts before. That's where we set up camp. To me, that's 50% check almost feels necessary, though it's it's possible it doesn't happen. It almost feels necessary, right? And then you look at the remaining move and you think, well, okay, you've been talking about 490 a lot. We'll go from that 850, 860 level, go down to 490. Look at where the midpoint is there. Hey, it's 650. It's right where we hit bottom here. It's an even 50% retrace within a 50% swing around this previous bottom to get you to that 490. Why is 490 so significant, you might ask? Man, I could probably go on and on and on about why I think it's significant. The main reason why I think it's super significant is I've already made the case that I think the cat ears and the waves all terminate very soon. And it just so happens that, again, it's an opinion, but it's my informed opinion based on the way I've done things on this stuff for a while. I think that these particular M shapes, right, we were talking about this before, I think that they all kind of intersect at the end. And I'm going to just have to just go with my gut on this and say, look, I've been looking at this for a long time. I know that not everyone's going to believe it, but I think it's true. I really do. I think that they intersect and they terminate eventually at the final kind of place, and that these guys, which are laying up upon each other the same iterations over and over till they shrink, they're going towards that point. And when I did that, I found 490 as the likely target. So even if, it might seem like that's not low enough. I know some people have said it could go lower. I've said it could go lower. I still think that's a really likely target here. I think when you look at 490, it's a strong target. Yeah, it looks like 50% from kind of like where we are now. But if you get that push up to the 8s, I still think it's a really strong target because you can get another 50% move down. And I think that the math is set up in a way that it makes sense to me, right? And then what happens after that? I'm going to stick to my guns. I think we're going to go up to 15-ish. And I've said 1440. It may end up being a little bit lower because the longer we wait to get up there, then the lower it could possibly be. This confuses some people as well because they think, well, if your initial target's right, shouldn't it be early January? Well, look, there's lots of time. You can see I drew it out. You can easily imagine spending a week up here and then spending a week down here and a week in between and a week going up. It's not that complicated. It goes pretty quick, but definitely possible. But even if it didn't happen and it took way longer, let's say you spend a lot longer down here in like the 490 land. Well, look, eventually when you do come up, where are you going to be? You may not be as high. And that's the thing that you have to kind of consider is like right now, it just so happens that check back to like the 1440 area just so happens to coincide with this marker that I don't think we've messed with yet. But all that being said, is it a guarantee? No, because again, if it takes like really long time, what if it didn't take till earnings, Booksy? Well, then when you push up, guess what? It's only 12. You know what I mean? So it's important to understand that the concepts that I'm talking about here have sort of like a time limit. They're not indefinite. And it's really, really important to understand that because if you don't, you're going to assume that, well, he's saying 16th. That means it can't possibly be like lower and it can't possibly be later. No. This is part of the reason why if I'm trading short term, like I'm waiting for breakout and confirmation, period. I do not pretend to be some kind of a genie that can predict everything perfectly. Like that's not who I am. I'm doing TA. I'm doing the best I can. If I think it's way out, I'll just get leaps for like 6 months out, right? If I'm not sure. And then you can do what Stockfather suggested and play straddles and do stuff like that so that you're not just over leveraging one direction. and assuming that it's going to hit. You should never, ever be doing that based on what somebody says on YouTube. Like, it's that simple. But that being said, like, am I confident that this is probably going to happen? Yeah, I am. I'm looking at this right now on the 4 hour. Look at that divergence on RSI on the 4 hour. Does that mean it's definitely going to happen? No, but this divergence happened previously right here. You know, a similar style divergence. And what happened after June 26th? Well, it went up into accumulation, then it rocked way up high. Now, ultimately, that was to go back up and check this level that was established on the way down, and then we distributed from it. Well, that's really similar to what I'm suggesting right here, right? Albeit, I'm suggesting that perhaps it happens in a slightly different way, and it comes back up to check this guy, which we haven't tested since dropping down, okay? And again, symmetrically, does that work? Is that perfect? Is that 1-to-1? No. You know, symmetrically speaking, this thing would go down to like basically 550. It would bounce, hit 690, and then it would drop all the way to 3, and then it would race all the way up to 15. That doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, nor do I think it has to be like perfectly 1-to-1. So I also think that's a bit of a stretch. But on the big picture, what do I think is happening? I still think this is coming to the end. I still believe that this is basically that final drop off, you know. And someone else is going to look at this and they're going to say, you're wrong, dude. It's like way over here, blah, 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 blah. Or why are you even using this thing? I can't tell you like how many times I think this has been helpful to me. But I do know that what I'm understanding here is basically how those waves are operating and where ultimately it's going to go back and try to test that main creek. I think that's the big thing. And that's the one that I'm not 100% positive about. I think it's pretty low, but I think that doesn't happen till like earnings of next year, more like March. So that's my thought anyways. And from there, yeah, I do think we're probably coming back up, and we may end up by mid next year getting back to those 30 and 40 levels, but not likely before then. We'll see. Okay. Does Stockfather have a valid point about this as a setup for Wyckoff being an LSPY? Yes. Is it possible that this is just like a little M cross in the middle and it's going to dump back down? Yes, because it lost that main cross. But I do think that when you look at this, I feel like it's definitely a possibility that it turns right back around and goes up higher for distribution. So that's all I got for you. I know it was a long video, but that was my weekly outlook. Try to do a little bit of everything. You know, I really like to spend more time with the Master Fractal with the better version of it, but I don't have it. So anyways, that's all I got for you. Hope you have a good one. We'll talk to you later.